I'm going to be talking about chord symbols. When we are analyzing music, when we are writing music down for others to play, we often use shorthand notation systems. And one of those is guitar chord symbols or jazz chord symbols, developed and used by jazz musicians and adopted then later by rock and pop musicians to communicate concepts, to communicate theoretical ideas or even specific notes and pitches that need to be used, and to communicate them in a kind of a shorthand way. And we need to be aware of them because we're going to be dealing with them through the semester and indeed using them in composition, in writing out some of our pieces, and we just need to be aware of what they mean and how to employ them correctly so that we are correctly communicating what we intend to communicate. So, what are these chord symbols? Well, they simply represent notes, they represent chords, and specifically they often represent either triads or seventh chords. Now, we're going to be limiting ourselves to triads today, and then when you watch the video on seventh chords, you will understand what a seventh chord is and how they're constructed, and then I'll add the chord symbols for seventh chords after that. But we do know what triads are. We know that if we have these three notes, for example, G, B, and D, that they create a triad because it's three notes, because each of the notes is a third apart from one another. We know this is in triadic structure, and we know that if we identify this third, and we would identify that as a major third and then a minor third, and if we identify that, we could then say, okay, this is a major triad, and we know it's a major triad because it has all the characteristics and the qualities of a major triad. It has three notes, the notes are a third apart, and the bottom two are a major third and the top two are a minor third. That creates a major triad. And we could create a minor triad or an augmented triad or a diminished triad because we know how to do that as well. That's great. What is it possible that there might be a way, and indeed there is, that we could represent that in an easy, straightforward notation? And the answer is yes, and it is simply that if you want to represent a major triad, you do so with the capital letter of the root of that triad. This therefore would be a G chord or G triad. And it's often referred to as a G chord. We know that a triad is a very specific type of chord. So we want to be a bit careful maybe using that term, or we could even, if we were really being picky, we could sort of say, you know, it's not actually a chord, or it is a chord, but it's a very specific type of chord called a triad. But we're not going to, you know, we're not going to be kind of highbrow about this in that way. We're simply saying that this is a G chord by which we know in common practice, in common parlance, we know that to mean it is a G triad. Okay? So that's G. If it's major, which it is, we know that because there's nothing else associated with it. If it's just a capital, it doesn't have to say. There are some systems which would say, okay, if it's major, we need to specify that and say it's a G major chord. But for our purposes, we're not going to worry about that. We're going to say this is a G chord. If it is a G on its own, it means it's major. Now, what if, however, it is minor? What if, in fact, this becomes a G minor triad? And we say, okay, we're going to play the G minor chord or the G minor triad. In this particular parlance, in this way of talking, in this way of dealing with music theory, the term chord and the term triad are kind of synonymous, even though we know not all chords are triad. So, what if it's G minor? Well, it's very simple. We simply take the chord, the G, and we add a small lowercase m, and that means it's minor. What if it is augmented? What if instead we have this chord? Then we take the large G and we add a plus sign. The plus means augmented. What if it is diminished? Then we take the G and we add a small circle. The circle means diminished. So, G on its own, major. G with a small m, minor. G with a sign, augmented, G with a small circle, diminish. Those are the 4 types of triad we have, and that's the way we notate it in guitar symbols, guitar chord notation. Right? So that means we can go the other way round. We can say to ourselves, okay, what if I have a piece of music and it has a melody that does this, let's say. There's our melody, and on the top of that we have the chord G. What that's telling us is, for as long as this chord exists above here, and these melody notes are going on, the performers need to be playing a G triad. They can play any notes from the G triad. And that will make sure that the G sound is in existence while that melody is going on. Now for guitar players it's very simple, they just play the G major chord, and that has all the notes in that they need. The bass player has to be a bit careful, because the bass player, this does assume that the chord is in root position. And we're going to look in a moment, how do you tell the bass player, or whoever is playing the lowest notes, how do you tell them that you want it instead in first inversion or second inversion? And we'll get to that in a moment. So the bass player has to be careful to keep the lowest note a G, otherwise they're changing the inversion of the chord, which may not be the intent of the composer. And then other players, let's say you've got a violin player or a clarinet player or whatever it might be, they have to play chords from the G, they have to play notes from the G major chord. And as long as they're doing that, everything's going to fit together. So, that's how you initially write chords to represent major, minor, augmented, and diminished. Now, as I said, what happens if you have them in inversion? What happens if you actually do want a G major chord, but you want it in first inversion? Well, let's remind ourselves what first inversion means. First inversion means we're taking the triad and we're moving the bass note up an octave. And that creates a chord. It's the same chord, it's still G, B, and D, it's still a G major triad, but it's in first inversion because it has the third of the chord as the lowest sounding note. How do we show that? In chord symbols, we show the G, that tells you it's G major, and then we say slash B to show that the bass note is the note B, which is the third of the chord. So you have to know something about music theory for this to make sense. If you just see G over B, and you don't know that a G major chord has G, B, and D in it, then you are not going to know that the B is the third of the chord, and that this is telling you to put the B in the bass, and because it's the third of the chord in the bass, that means it's first inversion. You're not going to know. You can still play it, you just aren't going to know in theory what's going on. You're going to know, hey, that's my bass note, and I need to play a B. I know that much. But now, hopefully, you know why you're playing a B, because you are creating the sound world that is a G major chord in first inversion. And the bass player is the person responsible for that. The bass player is the person who is putting the note into the bass that defines the inversion. So in the case of a G chord in root position, they're going to put a G in the bass. But in first inversion, they need to put a B in the bass. And it's logical that if we go on and we invert this again, this should not be a particular surprise to you. When we invert that chord again, we take the bass note up an octave, we end up with second inversion. Second inversion is when the fifth of the chord is in the bass. And logically, we show that by having the chord G this time over D, because D is the fifth of the chord. When you see G over D, that gives you the indication that the chord is in second inversion because it's a G major chord, G, B, D, and the D, the fifth of the chord, is the lowest note being sounded by the bass. So, what we've learned today, chord symbols tell you the members of the chord and tell you whether the triad is major, minor, augmented, or diminished. Any of these could be an inversion. If they are an inversion, then there'll be a slash, and the note that is in the bass, creating either first inversion or second inversion, will be indicated after the slash. So you can have combinations of this. So say to yourself, what happens if I have G minor over D? What is that telling me? See if between now and the next class session, you can work out, well, what does that mean? What does it mean if I have G plus over B? What is that telling me? What do those chord symbols mean? And if you can work out the answer to that, we'll discuss it in class next time and see if we can reach some conclusion on that. But in essence, the chord symbols are telling you what notes to play, and they're telling you what inversion the chord should be in.